Again, these are people proclaimed to be Christian and purport to be evolutionists. When they say, okay, explain the fall, they say, oh, I believe in a fall, Genesis chapter 3, but then they would quickly follow it up and saying, well, the fall is really like the second law of thermodynamics, that it's a natural process. Well, my friend, that's heresy. What we'd like to do before we get into really trying to exegete the passages in Genesis is to talk about some creation evolution type of things and the big picture of the importance of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And because these topics are so emotional amongst different Christians and non-Christians for that matter, and because there's been so many people that have either come to Christ or walked away from the faith because of these things, we thought it good to spend some time here at the beginning and just go through what we want to do right now in this session is to go through and talk for a minute about the big picture of what are the different views amongst different Christians about Genesis 1 and 2, and what are their importance, and why are they critical? So there's more than one view of Genesis here, and so we wanted to talk about that first and give a big picture to our audience.
One of the things, Glenn, when people go and study the Bible, we're big proponents of inductive Bible study, which means that you interpret Scripture with other Scripture. And after you do that, another thing that can be done is then to go to the outside resources and look and see what the outside resources say. But you have a good foundation of what Scripture says first before going to the outside resources. And so this is one of the areas that I like in our type and style of Bible study is that we will go over from time to time what the outside critics might say or what is outside of Scripture is said about the Scripture in order to give an overview of what other people say about that particular verse. And then we also work into it our view as well. So I'm looking forward to this session today, Glenn, because I know that you have several different views that are out there related to Genesis chapter 1 and the creation story.
And before we get lost in all these different views, I thought it probably best, Steve, to just summarize what I think here at the beginning, and we'll probably repeat it at the end. But to me, the critical aspect of how to approach creation in Genesis 1 and 2 is not the age of the earth. To me, that's an interesting discussion, perhaps valuable discussion, but it's not the critical point. And I've thought about this for quite a while. The critical point is the separation from God that happens in Genesis chapter 3. And the reason that's important is because over in Romans 5, we're told that because of the separation from God, death came through sin. Therefore, Jesus had to reconcile us. So what theologians call the fall, the first sin, is the separation from God. That's the critical part. If the separation from God is real, then we need a real reconciliation in Jesus Christ. If the separation from God in Genesis 3 is a figurative literary device, then why do we need a real reconciliation with God? If the fall was a figurative literary device, then why can't we have a figurative literary Jesus? And if you're in that realm, then now you're into heresy.
And I would add to that, Glenn, that a critical point is that God created. And if you have any type of a view where God didn't create Adam himself and creation itself as recorded in Scripture, then there's an issue related to what the view is. So along with what you said, the bottom line is that we have a God that created everything that we have today, including ourselves, was created by God.
And one last point before we just jump into these different views is that very often people that deny that God had any role at all in creation. The atheist, evolutionist type, they have almost a religious fanaticism about them. People that would, any other scientific kind of discussion, they're sort of cold-blooded about it, and they can talk about different science disagreements with a calmness. As soon as it gets into creation, these people have a fanaticism, and they get angry and they get very emotional, and it's almost a religious fervor that happens amongst some of these people. And so humanism really is, and naturalism really is, at least approached by people with the same type of psychological situation as a fundamentalist religion. And so that's one of the reasons why this is so important. And again, so many people have either come to Christ or walked away from Christ on these things. So what I'm going to do here is I've got 8 different views of creation in Genesis 1 and 2 that are held by sincere Christians. And there's sincere, well-meaning Christians that have held all of these views. And so there's ministries out there that their entire ministry is talking about these things. So there's no way in 1 or 2 sessions here we're going to be able to duplicate what these other ministries do full time. So all we're going to do is really give a flavor. We'll give a summary and give kind of the pros and cons of each one. So let's go ahead and jump in. The first one that we would hold is what I would call Young Earth Creationism. Young Earth Creationism says that the earth was, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, happened about 6,000 years ago. And they get that number from calculating the genealogies throughout the New and the Old Testament. And it comes out to about 4,000 BC, roughly. And so these people would hold that the creation days in Genesis 1 are 24-hour days that happened less than 10,000 years ago, roughly 6,000 years. And that this group believe that when it says day, it means day. And when it says evening and morning, it's very clear it means evening and morning. 6 24-hour days. This would be held by groups such as Answers in Genesis is a Young Earth organization. Another one is Institute for Creation Research. These would be Young Earth creationist groups. Well-meaning Christians would reply to the Young Earthers by saying such things as, the genealogies were never intended to be a calculation for an age of the earth. They're supposed to be just that, genealogies, to show a genealogical descendancy and not a scientific calculation. And there's reasons for that have to do with several reasons. We've covered this in the past, but there's no word for grandfather or great-grandfather or grandson or great-grandson in Hebrew. And there's proven gaps in son of, when it says son of or begat, then we know from comparing genealogies that there's some generations that are not mentioned. Another one is the first timestamp in Genesis 1 is at the end of the first day. So it says nothing of the beginning. And there's enough, according to the people that would respond to the Young Earthers, in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, there's enough language there to say, hey, we're not really sure when it began. We just know when the end of the first day was. And another response would be, if we go through and take Genesis 1 and 2 very literally, then we have to come up with what the logic people call ad hoc explanations. An ad hoc explanation is something that is grabbed and brought in just to answer this one question. And if you have enough of those, you're periodically bringing in things from outside the scriptures that are only for answering this one question. The sun was not made until day 4, and therefore how is there light on day 1? Oh, here's an ad hoc answer that, well, God may have provided the light. Well, he may have, but it's an answer that's pulled in. It's not part of the system. It's not in Genesis 1 and 2. You have to pull it in from outside. So if you have enough of those, it gets to be a little hard to kind of believe the story. Another one is if we take just purely literally, then days are not created until day 4. And it says it twice, actually, in Genesis 1:14, is that days were not created. Again, just purely literally, he makes days on day 4. So how can you have day 1 and 2 when he doesn't make the day until day 4? Old Earth Creationist says that places use the word day as a longer period of time in Genesis 2:4, Hosea 6, and Joel 2, and they point to passages like that. Second view that we have, again, held by legitimate, well-meaning Christians, is called Old Earth Creationism. And there's subgroups to this. One group would say that the earth and people were made a very long time ago, millions or hundreds of thousands at least years ago. A second group of Old Earth Creationists would say that the earth and the universe is very old, but that people in the Garden of Eden perhaps were made relatively recently. So they would have an old earth, but a young creation of people. There's a day-age theory that says that the days in Genesis are not 24-hour days. They're really representative of very long periods of time. This would be held by somebody like a Hugh Ross at an organization called Reasons to Believe.
I just want to jump in real quick, Glenn. With all of these so far that you've mentioned, they all agree that God created. They just have different views as far as when that particular creation took place. And this is related to the earth itself in your first ones that you've listed here, correct?
Correct. All of these people would say God did it, that the primary cause of the universe is the Lord. So there's also a theory called the alternate day-age theory. And the alternate day-age theory holds that the days in Genesis are literal 24-hour days, but that there's a long period of time in between the days. That these people would say that the Genesis 1 speaks nothing about the time in between the days, that you could have a 24-hour day, kind of a punctuated equilibrium, if you will, of creation, where you've got a long period of time and then a real quick one-day change by God, and then another long period of time and another quick change. Another theory is called the gap theory, and the gap theory was held that in between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, that there's a gap of a long period of time that's not mentioned. There was a Schofield reference Bible written by a man named C.I. Schofield, and his notes on Genesis 1 held that there was a gap in between. Towards the end of Genesis chapter 1, there's a word, go and replenish the earth in the old King James. And Schofield's reasoning was that, well, if it had to be replenished, it meant that it was something there before that had gone away, and now it had to be replenished. But that was really a misunderstanding of the word. Most of the modern translations say, go and fill the earth. Now, to that, those are old earth views. The young earth people would reply back to that, says, the language in Genesis 1 is quite clear. It uses the word day in the normal sense of the word day. And many, if not the majority of the Hebrew grammarians would agree that when it says evening and morning was the first day, and evening and morning is the second day, then day means day. And evening and morning, it's quite clear the context. And that taking anything outside of that is bringing in, according to these people, bringing in something outside the text and applying it to the text. So Young Earth says that Genesis 1 uses just normal language and that we should stick with the text. The third major view here is called theistic evolution. And theistic evolution used to be fairly clear, but it's gotten enough tentacles now to where it's somewhat morphed. Theistic evolution basically says that evolution happened, evolution being random mutations filtered by natural selection, that happened, but God worked through that process. That God, by creating the earth, worked through the process of evolution. And with that, they would say that evolution happened. If we were observing it, we would see evolution, but God was guiding this process. That's the basic theistic evolution approach. Now, as we'll see there's been some nuances and morphs to it to where now the term's almost not a good term anymore, simply because there's people that hold some different views that go up underneath theistic evolution that we'll hold in just a minute, some of the other views. But a response to theistic evolutionists. This view requires a large degree of literary license in the text. When it says, God said, let there be, then the normal sense of the language is that God just spoke it into existence. And there's nothing in the text about going through some sort of a process. So you're bringing ideas into the text would be the people that would disagree with the theistic evolutionist. And another criticism of theistic evolution is, to an independent observer, if somebody was just watching the process, you would see and observe no difference between a purely naturalistic process and a miracle of God. You're basically taking a miracle of God, which is what's in Genesis 1, and you're turning it into a natural process to where if you're just watching it, you wouldn't be able to see a difference. And the normal sense of every other miracle in the Bible is that it's very obvious that it's a miracle. And if a atheist naturalist can watch it and say, all I see is a natural process, no God here, and a Christian could look at it and say, oh, I'm seeing the hand of God here, then it's not really a miracle that fits all the other criteria for every other biblical miracle in the scriptures. If we're it just reeks of the idea of taking a naturalistic process and calling it what God did. Next, another criticism to theistic evolution is this group is accused of bending biblical concepts to the world rather than interpreting the text as written. Theistic evolution results in an explanation that's not really either evolution nor creation, because evolution by definition is a natural process. It's a natural process. So you're making a miraculous natural, which is a contradiction in terms. You're making an up down or an in out. It's a thing and not a thing. By definition, evolution works through naturalistic process. And you're now saying that this natural process was really a designed process by an intelligent maker that had a purpose behind it. So it tends to have issues also, lastly, with the doctrine of the fall, because the fall, again, is the critical part. I have heard evolutionists that proclaim to be Christian, when pressed on the fall, again, these are people proclaimed to be Christian and purport to be evolutionists. When they say, okay, explain the fall, they say, oh, I believe in a fall, Genesis chapter 3. But then they would quickly follow it up and saying, well, the fall is really like the second law of thermodynamics, that it's a natural process. Well, my friend, that's heresy. You've now taken the name of the separation from God and accepted the name, but you poured a meaning behind it that's really the same thing as friction or electromagnetism. And it's not a real separation from God anymore. And now we don't need a real reconciliation anymore. And so you've crossed a line into heresy.
What I see, Glenn, is with this theistic evolution is a group of people that feel that they want to come up with an objection that's brought up with non-believers. And so they take the non-believers' view and take it to a point to work God into the non-believers' view in order to satisfy the non-believers. And that just doesn't work. And as you pointed out, that leaves out the miraculous aspect out of it. And I would caution people in general, as they deal with skeptics and critics and non-believers, when they come up with certain objections, it's on them to provide the proof for what they're putting forth. It's not incumbent upon us to go and provide the proof that refutes what they're doing. And this kind of smells to me of that. They brought up, they being the non-believers, evolution. And so now believers have come back in to try and refute it with this theistic evolution. I'm sure there's more detail around that. It's something that's been around for several years, but it's something that's kind of backwards. Let them come up with the proof.
So that's that one. If you want more information on that, there's a group out there called BioLogos that's done a lot of work on theistic evolution. The next major category of explanation about Genesis 1 and 2 is called the genealogical Adam and Eve. Genealogical Adam and Eve. And this view says that all people today are descendants of Adam and Eve. That Adam and Eve were real people, and that we are all descendants of Adam and Eve from a genealogical sense. But this view would say that the way we explain Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is they would hold to special creation. By special creation, we mean immediate and quick of Adam and Eve in the garden. But that what these people would say is that Scripture doesn't talk about what would happen outside the garden. And so outside the garden, we've got regular traditional evolution happening, starting with small animals and getting to increasing complexity, ultimately resulting in a Homo sapien-like species that's outside the garden. And that when Adam and Eve were specially created inside the garden, outside the garden, you had evolution going on. And that when Adam sinned, he gets thrown out of the garden, then mates with and becomes family members with the species that were outside the garden. And so now all the people are many generations down the line, that we all have Adam and Eve as an ancestor. Therefore, we all inherited original sin, but we also had ancestors from these other beings.
Well, that was going to my question when you said, and we also have. So it sounds like what they're saying is that what the creation outside the garden was in line with the other creatures that God created, but yet Adam and Eve is a special creation inside the garden. Am I taking that right as far as what they're saying?
Correct. They would say inside the garden was even recent and quick. And so they would hold to almost young earth creationism inside the garden, but that outside the garden, you had evolution happening.
And at some point, you have the inside and outside coming together in order to form who we are today?
Yes, because they would say when Adam and Eve sinned, they got thrown out of the garden. And so this view would explain, okay, how Cain got his wife, or how Cain was worried about being attacked by people outside the garden. They would hold, it explains all of that, because it still keeps Adam as a first of this creation. But it explains these other beings out there, and explains some of the problems that the geneticist has with population genetics.
My last comment, because I know we need to move along, would be, well, then it sounds to me like you have a time conflict between the two outside, where it takes a long time to get to a point where the inside beings could then mate together with the outside. So anyway, that's we got to move on. But to me, that's the first thing that comes to my mind. You got a time conflict between those two views.
Response to that would be, one, what you just said. Another one would be it just seems to be an ad hoc explanation. Again, an ad hoc means I'm going out in space and grabbing an answer to try to fit the text, and not interpreting something as part of my theological system. It seems to be ad hoc, and it also raises questions about intermarrying with other species and what happens with inheriting original sin, things like that. If you want to know more about that, the genealogical Adam and Eve was the main proponent of that, as we make this, is a man named Joshua Swamidass. And again, don't question any of these people's sincerity as Christians, but this is just the position they were holding. Next one down the list. There's one that has Adam as a combination of history and myth. The term that got introduced is mytho-history. And this would hold that that when we read Genesis, it's true, these things happened, but it happened in applying it to a real creature that happened in history. It's just that the real instance that it was applied to happened in an evolutionary process. For example, they would say that evolution's happening, and that one species is begetting another one, and we have speciation happening through regular evolutionary processes, and that one of these species breaks off perhaps 500 to 600,000 years ago, that becomes the species that we are, and that's Adam. And that into that species, the very first one of those, God puts his image, breathes life into it, and that's mankind. So that the story that's told in Genesis 1 and 2 is true as written, but it is a story. It's like a type of an allegory that would apply to an evolutionary process. The person that proposed that these days is William Lane Craig. And again, evolution's happening, but one of the many myriad of speciation events that happened in evolution, one of them God picks and says that one. When that branch of the tree broke off, that's Adam. And I'm going to put my image into him. And then I'm going to write this account that allows for that process. It's just not explaining it in detail the way a scientist would. So that's this mytho-history, or Adam as a combination of history and myth. Response to that. This view provides no objective way to evaluate whether the text is cleverly written combination of myth and history. If we take an approach like that, there's really no way of determining whether this allegory aligns with history, or if somebody came up with a completely different way of applying it to a different history, simply because allegory is so malleable. And there's no objective way to tell whether this really works or doesn't, simply because once you allegorize something, there's no objective way to tell whether the allegory is true.
I was just fixing to say, so that's a very much of a subjective look at Scripture versus an objective look.
I would agree. It also has been accused of being some sort of a clever accommodation to current blowing winds of science, as opposed to just taking the text as written. Next one of the theories is that it has the Garden of Eden as an allegory of a temple. And this view would hold that the Garden of Eden is an allegory of a religious temple, and that Adam was a priest. And people that hold this view would line up things such as the descriptions of the tabernacle and the temple that come later in the Bible and say there's a series of things that we can compare these two to where they line up quite well in kind of an allegorical sense. So they would hold Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 as Adam's a priest. He's a priest in a temple called Eden. And if you try to really look at Genesis 1, 2, and 3 about Eden, it's a little fuzzy in there about, what is this Eden thing? And so they would line up and say it lines quite well with Adam being a priest and Eden being a temple, and that because Adam had this responsibility as a priest that he violated, therefore he's thrown out of the temple. Response to that. Humans have a grand ability to see patterns in things. And if we want to see patterns in things, we can see them. I can assure you, I can take two extremely different things and show parallels between them. We can almost invent two just totally, completely different things and draw some comparisons to them. They both exist. They both had a beginning. They both had an end. They both had a conflict in them. I mean, you can draw these comparisons to things. Other than a comparison of some other allegory, you can't read Genesis 1 and 2 and get that out of there. It's a stretch that stretched it pretty dadgum thin. Next, there's a view called, again, just trying to show there's many different views here held by sincere Christians. There is what I call a relativity view. And the relativity view says that it's both true that there was 6 literal 24-hour days, and there's 6 very long periods of time. But these people would bring in the idea of Einstein's relativity, in the sense that if you have something moving at the speed of light or near the speed of light at the beginning and then gradually slowing down, then if you're at one direction observing it, you would see 6 literal 24-hour days. And if you were on the other end observing it, you would see very long periods of time, simply because time changes with the speed of light. And when the speed of light is at the speed of light, it's one effect on time. And when it would slowly slow down, you would get a morphing of time, if you will. Time is not measured by the same measure depending on your observation point. This was, again, brought in some ideas from Einstein's theory of relativity. It was attributed originally to, there was a Jewish commentator called Nachmanides, and there's a couple of astrophysicists named Schroeder and Sarah Salviander that hold these views. There's a website, 6 Day Science, that you can go and find out more about this view. Sort of a response would be, not really sure how to test this. Nice theoretical physics theory, but how do you really test it and compare it to the scripture to really tell whether it's really happening or not? Those of us that are not detailed astrophysicists kind of get left out of the equation in how to evaluate things like that. Next one, and the last one out of these 8, is what's called the literary device theory. Literary device theory merely says that the entirety of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 is a literary story. It's a piece of literature that is giving information in a book to tell a story. And it has, according to people with this view, has no comparison at all to anything outside as far as process in the real world. These people would say it says nothing about science, that it never intended to say anything about science, that it's really just a literary device to explain some information. And these people would say that the days are really just categories. So I've got, here's the day where they made all the earth and the heavens. Here's the day where the plants and animals were made. Here's the day where the sea creatures were made, and that the numbers and the days are really only just numbering. Here's the first one, here's the second one, here's the third one. And it's just a literary way of communicating that God did it and saying that there's categories of things that God made. But these people would say it says absolutely nothing about how God did it or the science behind it. So those are at least 8 major views held by sincere Christians that have looked at these issues for quite a while. All of them have some degree of appeal, or people wouldn't believe them. I've found issues with all of them. And when we get into next time, we'll get into some of the major concerns just from a biblical interpretation standpoint. But again, just to summarize here at the end, the real critical part of all of this is one that as Christians, we need to have some charity. I've seen a lot of emotions, a lot of name calling between people, and I think that needs to go away. We need to be able to sit down as Christians and have some cold, calm discussions with people that might hold some views that disagree with us. And the real, again, thought about this for quite a while, the real point where we have to stop and say, time out, you've crossed the line, is with the fall. Are we really separated from God in a real literal sense, or is that some sort of figurative literary device?
So Glenn, as we sum up today, if you could just go back through and just read the topics of each one of those, don't go into any explanation, just read what the 8 are so that our audience kind of has that. They can jot them down if they want to. And I guess when we get into Genesis chapter 1, we'll kind of flesh out our particular views as we go through the text in Genesis 1, correct?
Yes. Yes. So there's young earth creationism, there's old earth creationism, there's theistic evolution, there's a genealogical Adam and Eve view, there's Adam as mytho-history view, there's the garden as an allegory of a temple, there's a relativity view, and there's a literary device view. And all of them are, again, done by Christians that are well-meaning and trying to explain what they see in Scripture with the data that falls around them. And we're going to have one more session before we really get into exegeting the text. And so those of you that have stuck in this far, tune in next time. We're going to ask some hard questions amongst people from all of these views, including people that claim we're just going to take this literally. You're still going to have some hard questions you have to deal with. So come in next time. We've still got some reasoning to do through these before we can come to any conclusions.
Thank you so much for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. May God bless you.